Hello, my online learners, and today we are looking at joints in Chapter 9. Now, as we go through this chapter, I want you to make a little summary table. So, when we look at joints, I want you to pay attention. There are three classifications of joints, and realizing that the stronger the joint, the more limited the flexibility. So we're going to look at the three classifications of joints, and as we go through them, I want you to write down a description in terms of its movability and its strength, and then put down a couple of notes with location. Okay, so work through this as we go through each one, and then I'll summarize it at the end. So I'm looking at the textbook. And in the textbook, first off, to realize that joints are where the movement occurs. And without joints, you wouldn't have the flexibility. If you remember the old Barbie dolls whose legs don't bend, no joint, no flexibility. Another term, the articu, that is the scientific word for articulations, are joints. And this is where bones meet. Some joints are completely immovable, some have limited movement, and some have more movement. But the more movement you have, the limited or the more fragile the joint. Okay? So let's look at the first type of joint. It's called a fibrous joint. And it's called fibrous because it starts as a joint, but basically the fibers, collagen fibers, will penetrate the bone with age and anchor it in place. So there's the fibrous is the regular name. Then you have the scientific name. Syn, like synthesis, means you're coming together. So synarthrosis is a joint that has come together. And the perfect example here is the skull, because as the baby is born, the skull is just a bunch of plates. And then as the adult gets older, those plates will grow and grow together and become very secure, very, very limited motion in a fibrous joint. But it is it's very secure. It holds strong, but it is very limited in motion. Okay, so that's joint number one. Shut this off and take a second to complete your table. Good. So how'd you do? Fibrous, also called synthrosis, collagen fibers, sutures of the skull, and that is the fibrous joint. The next joint has some movement, but not a lot. So it's both anchoring and movement. And it is a cartilaginous joint because it's got cartilage in it. And it's an amphiarthrosis. Now, the way I remember this is like amphibian. Amphibians are organisms that can live in both land and water. So an amphiarthritis is both movable and not movable. So that means it's slightly movable. So these are cartilaginous joints. They are basically there's cartilage in between them, cartilage pads, and they are slightly movable. The example here is the pubic symphysis. So it is quite solid unless it is triggered by birth hormones, and then it will flex. And this is quite often why females who have just had babies will have their hips out a little. Okay. And then the last is the pads between the backbone. Very good. So there's a cartilaginous joint in the fact that there's cartilage pads in between each vertebrae to help with the shock. Okay, stop the video and fill in the blank again. Yes, stop the video. Okay, so how did you do on this one? So cartilaginous joint has cartilage in it, amphi meaning both or slightly movable. Good, so that is the second type. The third type is really quite complicated. And it is the synovial joint, and that's because it has the synovial fluid, also called diarthrosis. Now, dia means through, so it can move through all of the movement, just like diarrhea goes right through you. Diarthrosis is freely movable. And there are numerous joints, very flexible, and they're actually quite complicated when we look at the structure. I won't ask you to be able to name every single structure, but I want you to realize this. So this is an example of, I think, the knee. Very complicated in the fact that you have different layers. So you have, just a second, let me get my, what am I doing? Oh, there we go. I want my pen. So you have your articulating cartilages. And again, that is to prevent cushioning and prevent friction. And they're very, very smooth. An example, if you look at it, the end of a chicken bone, you'll see it's very smooth. Then you have your fluid inside called your synovial fluid. And the synovial fluid is moist, it's thick, it's a lubricant, and it helps again with the movement. Then you also have them held together quite strong with these ligaments. Remember, ligaments go same thing to same thing. So bone to bone, that's a ligament. And then you also have this whole capsule. So what I want you to understand is a synovial joint is a very complicated, very detailed joint. And then you have this whole joint cavity. Very important for strength, but also for mobility. So you have really good mobility, but you can have problems here with the strength of your joint. So that is a concern with a synovial joint. So synovial joints are diarthrosis, very freely movable, and in many places in the body. So if you think of the synovial joint, you've got your fingers, your elbow, your arm, pretty much anything that has very good mobility is a synovial joint. Okay, stop the video, fill out your chart. Yes, fill it out on your own. Come on. Okay, so how'd you do? Synovial joint, diarthrosis, freely movable, easily damaged. If you think of how easy it is to sprain a finger or sprain an ankle or wreck your knee, very easily done. And these are the majority of the joints in your body are synovial joints. Now, when we look at synovial joints, there is 6 classifications of synovial joints. Okay, so we'll go through those, the different ones, but let's look at them in terms of a little bit of dancing. So let me set up my sheet here. So when you've got your synovial joint, there is the ball and socket where you've basically got a ball, such as the head of your humerus, in the socket, which is called the acetabulum of your shoulder. Ball and socket. Okay? Then you've got the pivot, where one joint pivots on the next one. The most common is the neck or in the wrist. Then you have a hinge joint. Hinge joint is your elbow. Perfect example of a hinge, and same with your knee. What I want you to realize is you've got really good motion in flexion extension, but you shouldn't have any sideways motion. So it's kind of in one plane. Then you have the saddle joint, and a perfect example of your saddle joint is your thumb. And it's kind of like one curvature moves over the next. Then you've got your condyle joint. A good example of your condyle joint is your fingers. And they have all sorts of movement. So it's like very good movement. And then you have gliding, where one thing just moves over the other, and the perfect gliding is your wrist. Okay, a way to remember this is, let's do a little dance. So, to begin with, you're at the dance and you just want to do some pointing. So this is glide, 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 glide. So you see how the wrist is just gliding. Just gliding past each other. That's the gliding. Then you want to do a fist bump. When you're fisting, dancing along, doing a fist bump. When you move your fingers to make a fist, you are moving your condyle joints. Okay, and condyle joints have all sorts of motion because they can go in many directions. Okay, good. And then get to the point where you're doing the single ladies. Now, in the single ladies, you are rotating one joint over the other. So this is a pivot joint. pivot, 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 and then you get really excited. So we raise the roof, raise the roof, raise the roof, raise the roof. Well, in the process of raising the roof, we're working on our angular joint. Raise the roof, raise the roof, raise the roof. And then you're really excited, so you're going to do an 60 swim. Now, as you're swimming, you're rotating that ball and socket inside your shoulder joint. So you got the ball and socket. There you go. And then, good job. You were dancing. Using the thumb is a saddle joint. Okay? From the beginning. Glide, 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 condyle, 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 pivot, 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 hinge, 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 ball and socket, ball and socket, ball and socket, ball and socket, saddle. Good job. Now summarize each of those movements in your table. Good. Let's carry on. When you're talking about motions, motions have terms too. So if you flex, most of you might know from flexing your biceps, when you're flexing, you are closing the angle of your joint. So this is flexion because you're closing the angle of your wrist. So flexion, flexion. If you bend your knee, you are flexing. And then if you straighten out, this is extension. And then if you go above and beyond, that's hyper. Can you see my hyper? So there's extension. There's hyperextension. Yes, I have weird elbows. One of the cool things about me. So, too, if you think about the wrist, there we go. So here is flexion, because we've got the angle here. This is extension, and this would be hyperextension, because it's beyond normal angle there. Okay? Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Good. That is the first couple. Then another one you're looking at is dorsiflexion and pointaflexion. I just remember point your toes is plantaflexion. Point, planta, dorsal is up. This is kind of weird because don't overthink it or you'll get confused. Plantar is point. Okay. Then you're looking at abduction and adduction. Abduction, if you think if you're going to abduct someone, you take it away. So abduction is away from your body. Adduction is towards your body. Ab, ad, ab, ad. Okay? So that describes that one. Then circumduction just means you're going around in a circle, or the end of the digit goes into a circle. Circumduction. Now, when you're looking at rotation, something is rotating. The most common one is your neck. Okay? Good. Supination and pronation. Supination, your hands are up, and that way, I remember because you could hold soup when you have supination. Pronation, you're down, and I remember that is if you're a pro basketball player, you will be bouncing the ball this way. Supination, pronation, supination, pronation, rotation. Okay? And also, the anatomical position is in a supine position, so this way there's no rotation. If I had a skeleton here, you could see that as you rotate this, your radius crosses over your ulna. The way I remember that, too, is your ulna is under your radius. Ulna, under. Okay? Supination, pronation, supination, pronation. And then there's inversion and eversion. Inversion, your palm, your soles of your feet touch. Eversion, they're away, basically. Supination, yeah, this usually has to do with being pigeon-toed. Then you've got protraction and retraction. Pro means you're moving forward. Re means you're going backwards. So protraction, retraction. Okay? Good. Now, the rest of this chapter talks about the joints in detail. You don't necessarily, I want you to pay attention to them have a quick look to see how ligaments hold things together. And then there's also bursa, which are basically little padded sacs, which help. I don't want you to learn all these parts. I just want you to realize and appreciate that these are really complicated. And if you want to have a look at them, get some chicken wings and take apart your chicken wing bones and pay attention at the end, because chicken wings or a good drumstick, you will see that there is some beautiful ligament there. Okay, so those are the 3 type and the movement. There is on your webpage this beautiful sing-along song where you can practice your movements too, and that is chapter 9.